Hi, we continue in Genesis 26 today as suddenly, seemingly out of nowhere, Isaac becomes a farmer. As you can see on the left side of the screen there in verse 12, where we hear Isaac sowed seed in that land and in the same year reaped 100-fold. So we're going to have to explore what is going on here with the only of the patriarchs that becomes a farmer and what unfolds, and how that recalls both the curse in Genesis 3 and Cain in Genesis 4 as the question of agriculture as the way Yahweh is calling people to go in the face of cities and other options for how to live in the land. So as you can see on the right side of the screen, we've been following this chiasm through the entire section from 25:19 to 35:22, and we've been in this green section here, this interlude in chapter 26, which is parallel to the interlude in chapter 34. And when we get to chapter 34, we'll look at the many parallels, but among them are the question of sex with a sister and king's power over women and various other things that we'll see, including settling. So as we've been noting, the sections are in chronological order here. This is out of chronological order as we've been looking at because it needs to fit the chiasm and need to be put here. So these things happen before Jacob and Esau are born and before Isaac and Ishmael bury Abraham at age 175, except for the fact that we're going to hear in this later in this chapter that Abraham had already died. So we're going to have to deal with the inconsistency of that with our structure. But otherwise, we've been assuming that this happens. There's no evidence that Jacob and Esau are around, and Isaac and Rebekah seem to be relatively young people and not so old as they would be after Abraham was dead, and their kids were older, and all kinds of other things that happened. So there's inconsistency we'll have to look at. And as we've been looking at the key words, I change this as I sometimes do when we get farther into a chapter. So if you downloaded or you looked at the one that's published at radicalbible.net, I'm publishing a new one that matches this, because a couple of things I missed because translations render them inconsistently is the use of the Hebrew Shem and Sham, which look identical in Hebrew, but only a vowel pronunciation is different. Shem is name and Sham is there. And so we see name and there, all kinds of places in here. And there is to indicate there the issue of place. And the place is Gerar of the Philistines. And so what is this patriarch doing among the land of the Philistines? And we've been looking at one of the issues is the parallels between Isaac among the Philistines and David among the Philistines in 1 Samuel 29 in particular. Both of them, as we see, involve a quote-unquote Israelite, because technically Isaac is not an Israelite, coming to dwell among the Philistines, who are completely anachronistic in the story world of the patriarchs. The world in which they were prominent was the world of David in the 10th or the 9th century BCE, not a millennium before that, long before the sojourn in Egypt for 400 years, etc. So in both situations, a Philistine king and or a military commander perceive the newcomer as dangerous and powerful and demand that he leave. But in the Isaac situation, it's because he's become a rich farmer. And the David situation, it's because the legend of his killing the tens of thousands has echoed into the ears of the Philistine commanders, and they don't trust that he'd be on their side. So I'd like to suggest that something that's going on here is the authors of Genesis perhaps having the David story in mind, or perhaps the authors of the David story having the Genesis story in mind, and we're not sure on that, but I'm assuming here that the David story came first, although the evidence is ambiguous, as we've been looking at in the Samuel series, is that it's contrasting two forms of becoming powerful through agriculture and becoming powerful through military valor and might, and the political power that comes from that, as David later becomes a king, although he's not actually a king in this time period in 1 Samuel 29, although Samuel has anointed him in Yahweh's name, but he hasn't taken power yet because Saul is still reigning and still alive. So we have to be listening to those stories together in some interesting ways. Another aspect that connects our stories here, and I didn't post this till now, even though the chart you see on the right side involves things we've already seen, until it was complete. So I just want to highlight, as I've been naming without this chart, that what we're seeing in chapter 26 is not just a pastiche of assorted traditions about Isaac that have been stapled in here by some clumsy editor, but a carefully written echo with variation on Abram then's first journey with Yahweh. And so we see both of them start with a theophany, and you see in the color coordinated things similarities there, and the reference explicitly back to the oath that I swore to your father Abraham from the mouth of Yahweh, obviously this right here. And so I haven't reproduced here all the promises of Yahweh, but to highlight at the beginning, they both both get a theophany with a promise of blessing, and they both go. Curiously, Yahweh's start to Abraham is, go from your country and your kindred, etc., to the land I will show you. And Yahweh says now that Isaac's in the land, don't go to Egypt, but settle in the land that I shall show you as a foreigner, as an alien, which is what he's doing there in Philistia, or at least in Gerar. And we see that happens also to Abraham when he's Abraham in chapter 20, when he resides in Gerar as an alien in the same place. So we saw that already as one parallel. We also see the blessing specifically identical. Your offspring is numerous as the stars of heaven. And then we saw the wife-sister story, both as a result of a famine in Genesis 12, but not in Genesis 20. Both of them involve the patriarch thinking that because his wife or his woman is beautiful, that the civilized, quote-unquote, people with the king will kill them, kill the man to get to the woman. And we see the parallel there. And then after that, after they leave, we see Abraham becomes very rich in livestock and silver and gold, much of that the gift from Pharaoh, whereas Isaac becomes rich without the gold and silver, but with flocks and herds and a great household, which is literally many slaves and servants, because of his agricultural harvest. And both of them lead to strife. The strife between Abraham's herders and Lot's herders that leads to them separating, and the strife between Lot's people and the Philistines, which also leads to them separating. But they lead to them separating here in peace. And we'll see how that also contrasts with situations that don't quite end with such peace between the people of Genesis and the people around them, especially in the chiastic parallel in chapter 34, when it ends with extensive violence. So let's put the keywords. Well, before we get to the keywords, let's look at a couple of things that we looked at in the introduction to this chapter, just to highlight their relevance here. So some of those issues are the relationship with the rest of Genesis, and I was just noting that here. The question of the time and composition of editing, is what's at issue here. So depending upon which one of these we might think, and it could be others, that determines Genesis's relationship with the story in 1 Samuel of David among the Philistines, which, as I was noting at the end of the 1 Samuel series, may well be from the exilic or post-exilic period here. So they may have been writing in conversation to each other for all we know. So those are the main issues we need to be paying attention to here. So with the keywords, let's begin our passage. So Isaac sowed seed in that land. And sowing seed throughout this is a double entendre, because zera, the word for seed, is also the word that we saw in the theophany blessing for descendants or offspring. So Isaac's seed is both what he puts in the ground and also what he puts in Rebekah to produce children. And both of those are blessing. And so we see Yahweh blessed him, because as we've seen throughout Genesis, contrary to the popular notion in some prosperity churches and other contexts today, where blessing is deemed to be anything you want, or especially material wealth, blessing in Genesis is fertility. And that can mean wealth. When the earth is fertile and is under your control, that can mean wealth, although there isn't really a word for wealth here. The word is simply powerful. And it isn't even for rich, became great or became powerful. So it's not a measure of money or of wealth as in terms of money, but of the power of agricultural possessions to be turned into money, or certainly to be turned into abundant food. And so he's only going to actually sow one pair of children, as we know. We've already seen Jacob and Esau narrated in chapter 25 out of chronological order. So we can see this is referring to both the kinds of seeds which Yahweh blessed him with. And the reaping of 100-fold is not magical. That's what in a good season a harvest would render. It's what we hear in Mark, and this parallel in Matthew, what Jesus says in the seed parable of producing 100-fold. So as one notes, the best that could be expected in Palestine. So it's considered a blessing, but not necessarily what we may call a miracle. It's not outside the bounds of what the earth could produce. And so we see here the word gadol for great 3 times in the sentence, and it gets translated differently. But here the more and more highlights it. Vayalik, halak, halak. So the gradual process of becoming greater and greater through this agricultural harvest. Although we only hear 1 year of agricultural harvest. We don't hear that it goes on for many years. And we don't know if this is supposed to convey more than 1 year or not. And so we hear in verse 14, this is raising the ecological issues that we last saw in 13:5 in the parallel here, when the land could not carry them. Literally, here it says the land could not support both of them, but could not carry them. So the land, as a character in the story, is teetering under the weight of this massive burden of herds and flocks and tents, etc. And that's going to be the issue we'll look at in the scene that follows, with the Philistines stopping up Isaac's wells, the wells that his father had dug and that he redigs, and they keep stopping them up again because Isaac's agriculture is a threat to their indigenous local patterns of ecological tending of the land, as we see in so many places today where corporations, especially in India, where Coca-Cola is infamous for taking water that belongs to farmers and using it to bottle Coca-Cola. Isaac isn't doing this for the global commodity market, but as we'll see, his extensive agricultural production will be a threat to the Philistines, just like David's killing reputation was a threat to them. So he had possessions of flocks and herds, which presumably he either inherited from his father, because we already heard that Abraham gave all he had to Isaac. He did not give anything to the sons of Keturah except specific gifts. So presumably he passed on his flocks and herds, although those may well be a result of his agricultural largesse that he sold. We don't know. And the great household is really covering over here numerous slaves or servants. Perhaps the New RSV authors were embarrassed about that, but that's what it is. He's got numerous slaves and servants. He's a rich, powerful man. And so the Philistines envy him, using this word quan here, which is used later for Rachel envious of Leah's fertility, and of Joseph's brothers jealous of him. And we also see it as Yahweh's jealousy of Israel. It can mean zeal in a positive sense. So it's a word that covers a lot of emotions around a passionate feeling looking out at somebody else, either positively or negatively. Here it's plainly negative and could be translated jealous. Although in our Genesis story, we know nothing about the Philistine economy. In the David story, we certainly know they control iron production and iron tool sharpening and such, so that nobody can get sharpened agricultural tools unless they go to the Philistines. So they're portrayed as successful agriculturalists who turn that agricultural wealth into military might. But we see nothing of that in the Genesis story, and we don't have any reason to think of the Philistines any different than the other local kings we've seen from places we wouldn't know famously, like Pharaoh in Egypt. And so we see now this retrospective to the past, and we'll set up a chiasm we'll look at next time in verses 15 to 18. The Philistines had stopped up and filled with earth all the wells. The word for stopped up, sitmum, is only here in verse 18 in Genesis, highlighting that, used again in 2 Kings also for stopping up wells. And so literally filling them, as we see with earth here, but literally with dust, not with soil, with afar, the stuff we saw in chapter 2 that the humans are made from when God scoops it up and breathes the breath of life into them. So they fill that topsoil, if you will, into all the wells, so there's not access. And the kind of wells we are imagining here are not like deep water wells like California agriculture produces thousands of feet deep, but rather the shallow wells that are just tapping into some kind of stream that's underground. And so it would be relatively easy to fill that with earth and stop it up. But highlighting the ones his father's servants had dug in the days of his father Abraham. And we'll see that dug will be a key word as we continue into this next section here, all the digging of wells you can see in orange there. And so given this obvious abundance here, Abimelech says to Isaac, "Go away from us. You have become too powerful for us." Using a word only here in Genesis, it's hard to pronounce without the vowels, but atsameta here with the full form, but meaning too numerous. And that's literally what it means. It's echoed in Exodus when Pharaoh and the Egyptians see Jacob's descendants as too numerous. As my note below says, a negative effect of the blessing. That there's too much blessing, there's too much fertility, and they're too abundant. But it's interesting that Abimelech responds this way by sending him away rather than pushing him away, or by killing him, or by taking his wealth, which he could certainly do. We have no reason to think that Isaac has any military strength. He has servants, but we know nothing about whether they're armed or powerful or not. Presumably they're servants to help with agriculture and with the flocks, but we know nothing more about that. And so Isaac simply does what the king says. He departed from there and camped in the valley of Gerar and settled there. And the word for camped is different than the word we heard earlier in the mouth of believe Yahweh for camped, Va'kan here, and camped. And it's only in 33:18 in the chiastic parallel, really highlighting the power of that chiastic parallel. It's 140 times in the Hebrew Scripture and 74 times in Numbers when the Israelites are traveling in the wilderness. And that's part of the point. Should Isaac be traveling on the way like his ancestors or like Abram has done and not be settling? Or should he do what he does here and settles there, which is exactly what Jacob will do at the end of chapter 34, setting up the rape and violence scene that we see in the rest of chapter 34. So what will happen after Isaac simply leaves the town of Gerar but camps in the valley of Gerar and settles there, certainly still within the ambit of the Philistines? We'll have to see what happens with that next time. See you then. Bye-bye.